So I am going to talk to you about microbiota. My work is fundamentally based on two things: detoxification and working with gut microbiota. I do not know of any pathology or any person who cannot improve with this pair of elements. In some cases, it will be the causal element. In others, it is simply an aggravating factor or a consequence, but they are always fundamental elements for improving health. Here, I will focus a lot on the central nervous system, but from any pathology. 2001, I believe that good work could be done from this approach. To study the toxins related to a specific pathology, that is a group of pathologies, and to examine the scenario of gut microbiota in that group of pathologies. The worst scenario of microbiota I always encounter is in neurodegenerative diseases, especially in autism. Use, and that is the worst scenario. Because we are going to name many things that can happen when there is dysbiosis, when there is an imbalance of the gut microbiota, and in these cases, all of them apply. It's not that they have some of the elements, it's not that they have a production of ammonia or biogenic amines or signaling, it's that they have it all. What is the difference? My experience is that the microbiota is very similar in autism as it is in Parkinson and Alzheimer. I am speaking about things I have more experience with. But of course, this alteration is not the same when we are forming the nervous system as when it is already formed, which is something that Pillar has also raised on this topic. I would lean heavily towards the 1,000 days diet that you propose, meaning the importance of nutrition during pregnancy and extending up to 1,000 days. Nutrition is important there. It is more crucial than ever to be aware of exposure to toxins, and the consequences will undoubtedly be much greater. The gut microbiota is also more than important during that initial exposure. The mother's microbiota is absolutely fundamental. When I am asked what they can do before getting pregnant, I tell them to do a good detoxification and work on their gut microbiota. You won't be able to give your children a greater or better inheritance. That is what they carry forward. 2001. Then, 2. Understand a bit how microbiota affects the central nervous system. We need to comprehend this wonderful macrosystem, which is the microbiota-gut-brain axis. Here, this would be like anti-specialization. The trend has progressively been to specialize, and although one can specialize in something without losing context, it has become increasingly decontextualized. And in the end, the one who looks at the stomach does not know if the person has a brain. And this is just the opposite. One studies, you relate things, you see microbiota, you see digestion, you see the brain, you see the mind, you see I don't know what. And so everything goes exactly in the opposite direction to that exclusive specialization of everything else. And yesterday, we discussed in a conversation that being a specialist in something should not make us lose sight of the whole. It's not that one cannot specialize. Each of us is better at certain things, but we must not lose the context. It's just that if we do, everything will be lost, absolutely everything. And all the studies, as Pilar said, and everything that is known from studies that are completely decontextualized from reality. So, from my point of view, those conclusions are really not valid if they are not properly contextualized. As I will explain at the end with the topic of biofilms, in vitro studies of bacteria tell us very little about the reality of how those bacteria live in the body in vivo. Medicine studies a lot in the dead, studies a lot out of context, studies a lot a piece of tissue that we take and analyze. We need to see what happens in the living being. Thus, the nervous, endocrine, and immune regulatory systems are in constant communication, constituting the great neuroimmune endocrine system. Any change in one of the systems immediately affects the others, one way or another. And also, I would say, adding a bit of a quantum nuance, that it is not very fast. It is simultaneous. There is a simultaneous response in all systems. The microbiota affects the functioning of each of these systems and the communication between them. Therefore, we can increasingly see more studies linking this microbiota problem with anxiety, stress, and depression. I mean, the response to stress, for example, one can have stress, but it is not the same as how autism, schizophrenia, Alzheimer, etc. respond. We are increasingly seeing studies that reveal how the alteration of microbiota colonization affects brain development and behavior. The gut-brain axis is a well-known communication pathway that connects us to the three major regulatory systems. Until not long ago, we talked about the two brains. This has evolved, and those of us who have been present in this for many years have seen it and have been expanding our understanding. Another thing I consider important is that when one works in this field, when expanding on things, it is not to discard this field. I have been working for many years, and I have been adding more data to a core from a perspective where one steps back and has a broader view, but not an invalid one. The previous information was just incomplete. I believe this is important because it seems like we are talking about something new and everything else seems to be disregarded. It is still valuable. We are contextualizing it. There is an increasing capacity for data unification. So, what I was talking about first were the two brains. First the gut brain, then the two brains, the SEMA gut-brain axis. And the most accurate thing up to the moment we are in is to talk about the microbiota-gut-brain axis. So the gut microbiota would be a significant understatement. To say that it influences the digestive system goes far beyond that. The more I delve into microbiota, the more fascinating it seems to me, and the more things you discover. This is an image that I really like, very graphic, of the great communication that this entire axis represents. It is truly impressive. Just imagine if we look at this separately, how little truth it holds. We need to see the whole picture simultaneously. So, well, without further ado, it's the fibers. What does the microbiota-gut-brain axis comprise? Well, it includes the neuroendocrine system, neuroimmune system, sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, enteric nervous system, and of course, the gut microbiota. I have been searching for factual data that confirms this bidirectional communication, and you will find it everywhere. But it is very curious. And just with this slide, we need to completely rethink medicine that tells you this cell produces this, that cell produces that. No, excuse me. Potentially anything is anything. And in fact, originally, that is how it is. For example, the cells of each of these systems have receptors for the mediators of the others. Why is that? It must be for a reason, right? Immune cells not only have receptors for cytokines, but also for mediators from the other two regulatory systems. Cells from all three systems can synthesize mediators from the others. In other words, we have a capacity for adaptation, which is what keeps us alive, because otherwise, given our current circumstances and the way we live, I don't think life would exist on the planet. But the body is impressive, and the teamwork with the microbiota is fascinating. Nervous and endocrine cells can produce cytokines, meaning this is a dance. And depending on the need, the body uses one resource or another. The mediators of the immune system act on cells of the nervous system and endocrine system and modify their functioning. Mediators from the nervous system and the enteric nervous system exert effects on immune cells. In other words, as you can see, all of them have receptors for each other. At a certain moment, they could produce substances that are characteristic of the other. In conclusion, we have here a well-established relationship between the three regulatory systems and the microbiota. This would be the enteric nervous system, which in itself would be enough to talk about for a few hours. It is fascinating. We have 100 million neurons in the intestine, the plexuses. Between the muscle layers and in the submucosa are clearly visible there. And there we have 100 million neurons, no less, which are the same as those we have in the spinal cord. It is connected to the central nervous system and not only allows for gastrointestinal homeostasis, but also influences feelings, emotions, motivations, and higher cognitive functions. It has the capacity for intuitive or immediate decision-making and is more related to that unconscious part. We must also remember that the mind is not in the brain, but rather outside of it. We are not going to locate it, but part of our mind is likely related to the enteric nervous system. Well, the microbiota determines the proper development of the enteric nervous system, and then through the relationship of this enteric nervous system with the other systems, and in turn with the central nervous system, it has a lot to do with the entire maturation process. In short, it is a communication, one, interaction with the three main regulatory systems. Well, as I was saying, communication is not limited to the intestine, but there is a communication that is the most well-known, which is that of the vagus nerve. Everything that happens in the enteric nervous system is communicated to the central nervous system through the fibers of the vagus nerve, or otherwise through other pathways, via the blood, through other signaling. Well, this pathway is very well known and is one of the pathways that we find blocked, which does not transmit information properly. In neurodegenerative diseases where we see symptoms of cognitive difficulties, this pathway is always interrupted. Additionally, a dysbiotic microbiota, an unbalanced microbiota, also opens the blood-brain barrier, which makes us more exposed to toxins. And this whole issue leads to a mess that is ultimately difficult to escape from, because one thing leads to another, the other causes more dysbiosis, resulting in more signaling, and it's madness. It's madness. Well, I believe that the blood-brain barrier also opens when the intestinal barrier opens. In other words, there are different publications on the subject, not only regarding the substances that arrive chemically, but also simply due to symmetry. As one loses the integrity of the intestinal barrier, one also loses the integrity of the blood-brain barrier and becomes more exposed. Well, this is a bit more of the same, talking about how signaling from one side can affect the other and vice versa, and we lose all the homeostasis of the body, the balance. And well, logically, after all this we are discussing, that this influences that the signaling then reaches the brain, that the barrier opens. It is not difficult to think that there may be behavioral problems arising from microbiota issues. On the other hand, we already know that one system can produce the mediators of the other, which has receptors for all of them. But apart from that, the microbiota itself also comes into play, and by being capable of producing these mediators. So, well, microbiota is fundamental in neurodevelopment. Remember that. Any damage you have during those first 1,000 days will stay with you for the rest of your life. It is not the same to reverse a dysbiotic situation in Alzheimer's, depending on the advanced state, than in depression, where we often fix the microbiota and many depressions disappear. However, in the case of Alzheimer's, the damage is already done, because the central nervous system did not mature. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I want to emphasize that it is a much more complex and labor-intensive task. Balanced, eubiotic intestinal microbiota signals well, so there is a straightforward conversation. Well, between the gut-microbiota-brain axis, dysbiotic intestinal microbiota sends poor signaling, disrupting the functioning of the central nervous system. This would also explain what Teresa was saying. If this communication did not exist, and if signaling from the gut were not so important, aggressive behavior, for example, towards gluten, would not make much sense. There must be something immediate happening there. Microbiota also produces neurotransmitters. These intestinal bacteria are impressive, and seeing them in isolation is like studying a single ant instead of examining the infrastructure of the anthill. Here, I believe that the fundamental aspect of microbiota is to study teamwork. That's why we have only 1/3 of microbiota common to most people. 2/3 are completely individual. However, for functional purposes, we all perform the same functions. We produce vitamins. Neurotransmitters, do you understand? So, well, what matters is the overall function of the teamwork that all species, bacteria, virus, archaea, 2000 perform. Everything that lives in the gut exists for a reason, has a function, and works together. That is the most important thing. Well, that's it. The neurotransmitters produced in the microbiota also send a signal to the enteric nervous system, which in turn sends it to the central nervous system. This is simply a very representative image of how healthy brain health, meaning proper mental and brain function, influences the normal functioning of the intestinal microbiota, a state of eubiosis, and that eubiosis itself signals correctly for proper brain function. And in turn, dysbiotic alterations generate, apart from digestive problems, changes in behavior, perception, sensations, and whatever else, and that alterations at the brain level have repercussions, causing dysbiosis. Yes, there are already, well, I have seen different studies that discuss how a week of high-intensity stress leaves the gut similar to taking an antibiotic, and how stress increases intestinal permeability. This image also seems very significant. To me, in the context of the entire conversation we have among all these great systems, and we are going to see just a little bit about which mechanisms directly affect the central nervous system, because we have only talked about how they communicate with each other in order to understand how this communication can be altered. So there are different mechanisms by which dysbiosis, the imbalance of the gut microbiota, can affect brain functionality, influencing intestinal permeability, production of cytokines, that is, signaling, inflammation, which we previously discussed as potentially being the basis of all diseases, the synthesis of toxic compounds, which we will also mention, even if just briefly, neuropeptides and their respective precursors, the modification of permeability, the issue of intestinal hyperpermeability that we are hearing more about, is of tremendous significance. It is of impressive importance, and we will try to examine everything that occurs as a consequence. Could there be a possible impact on processes of neurogenesis, neurotransmission, and neuroinflammation, which would lead to alterations in neurodevelopment? You will have your experience with that, right? Dysbiosis is not actually a lot of different things, because many issues arise as a consequence of dysbiosis. However, I will detail them a bit by parts to make it clearer. Dysbiosis itself alters the regulation of barrier function, meaning that if dysbiosis is maintained, the integrity of intestinal permeability is ultimately lost. An increase in, once again, local and systemic pro-inflammatory substances that then activate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis through the vagus nerve, alters the immune response, which is no small matter, and disrupts the synthesis of gastrointestinal hormonal peptides. Among the symptoms I have found as possible neuropsychiatric consequences of anxiety, depression, and behavior are alterations in social behavior, eating behavior disorders, cognitive dysfunction, disruption of the development of the central nervous system, disruption of the circadian rhythm, and immune response. All these alterations are very immediate. Following a dysbiosis, without further elaboration, throughout the presentation, there are many types of dysbiosis. Not all are due to the overgrowth of proteolytics, but today I will focus on the toxins produced when proteolytics increase and the biofilms that form when proteolytics increase. So I will talk to you more about this, but dysbiosis is any type of quantitative or qualitative imbalance of gut microbiota. For example, I recently saw a person who has been dealing with their gut for a long time, going here and there. And it seems like we are looking to see if this has grown, if there is candida, or if there is something else. What was happening to this person is that they were without gut microbiota, meaning there was a decrease in both the quality and quantity of microorganisms, which is as harmful as having an overgrowth of others. The thing is, when talking about the nervous system, I have chosen to focus more on proteolytics because in my experience, that is what I commonly encounter. But remember, of course, we are talking about inflammation. Immunomodulation will be fundamental. We are discussing the loss of intestinal wall integrity, and we would need to look at muconutrients and the production of short-chain fatty acids. But since there isn't enough time, I've decided to talk about these bad ones that give me a lot of trouble and with whom I am quite trained to work. Proteolytic bacteria are those that primarily live in the descending colon to perform proteolysis, the digestion of proteins. They are not bad in themselves, but they need to be in a very small amount, 0.01. The problem arises when they grow, when they translocate, when they go on to encounter other worlds, because they are no longer restricted to that descending colon. And this is more than common. I have hundreds of stool analyses because I have been working with this for many years. And the increase of proteolytics is very common. Moreover, it is very important. And in fact, that is why we have arranged this order of presentations. Where does the dysbiosis come from? From the garbage that reaches the intestine. In other words, there can be temporary factors from a drug, there can be radiation, or I don't know what, but fundamentally, certain bacterial groups or groups of parasites or viruses grow depending on the waste that arrives in the intestine. That is why I, for example, never recommend deworming without cleaning the environment that has led to the growth of the parasites, because otherwise you are removing something that continues to be a resource for the body. The body never does anything for free. It never makes mistakes. It only does what it can given the circumstances. So, yes, we are going to try to cleanse the microbiota, specifically the proteolytic one. And we clearly need to work on the environment that led to the overgrowth of that type of bacteria. Well, so what we were saying is that they are bacteria that fulfill their function, but if they grow too much, they give us trouble. They behave as facultative pathogens, meaning that when they grow, they act as pathogens, producing potentially toxic substances such as amines, ammonia, and scatole. This is absolutely common in neurodegenerative diseases. And I would say that always, or at least in everyone I have seen, in autism there is always a significant presence of ammonia, which in fact, certain behaviors depend on that exposure to ammonia. They acidify the physiological pH of the body because they deplete the circulating reserve of bicarbonate, and additionally, due to an increase in proteolytics in the intestine, it alkalinizes. The intestine must be acidic. And in the body, there is no possibility of alkaline, alkaline, acidic, acidic. If we alkalinize the body in the intestine, we acidify it. In other words, we are buying all the tickets to get sick from anything. In anything, okay? Besides, there is no need for liver overload. There is something I hear frequently for the liver, to be overloaded or intoxicated from the intestine, which we see very commonly. There is no need for increased intestinal permeability. Through the portal vein, all the junk arrives. Instead of blood loaded with nutrients, it is blood loaded with everything. These bacteria damage the mucosa of the intestinal wall, potentially leading to chronic inflammation and alteration of intestinal permeability. And the physiological intestinal pH becomes alkaline, favoring the development of more pathogens that will thrive there, such as Candida and others, creating a veritable feast for them. The second mechanism by which the gut microbiota can affect the central nervous system, which is actually part of what we have discussed, regarding dysbiosis, would be the alteration of intestinal permeability. This is extremely serious and of limitless significance because from this loss of integrity, everything passes through here. Bacteria, toxins, undigested food, well, everything we can imagine. And we can relate this fundamentally to inflammatory disease, that is, to autoimmune. In other words, as soon as this happens, we will find a lot of things in the blood that shouldn't be there, and the immune system is activated. Immune activation would be another pro-inflammatory mechanism that we encounter which can affect the nervous system, such as the production of certain pro-inflammatory enzymes that impact the blood-brain barrier once again. And we return to the same issue through the neural pathway. This image is also very representative because it not only explains how this altered signaling can lead to problems in the central nervous system, but it could also result in cardiac issues, pulmonary problems, and visceral issues of all kinds because they are all connected by the same cable. So, well, the vagus nerve regulates various vital functions, and the gut microbiota can induce signals via the vagus nerve, such as the increase of pro-inflammatory cytokines and the activation of mast cells, etc. I can tell you that each slide could be used to talk about this for a long time. Another way in which the gut microbiota can affect the central nervous system is through the alteration of tryptophan metabolism. I believe this is very representative. These cycles can alter the concentration of kynurenine, which is a metabolic catabolite of tryptophan. So, well, without further ado, I have also included a couple of studies and information that I found very interesting. There are studies that relate the kynurenine pathway to, well, everything, autoimmune diseases. We come back to the same thing: rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's. In short, the scenario is the same for many pathologies, whether they are autoimmune, cancer, or related to the central nervous system. The point is that we must not forget that one does not get sick from what one wants, but from what one can. So in the purchase of these tickets, when the barrel overflows, each one does what they had, or the place of least resistance that homotoxicology talks about. In the end, depending on your predispositions, you will lean towards one path or another, along with your personal situation at any given moment and your life. Oh, it's all quite something. Well, another thing that is altered by the gut microbiota is the gastrointestinal hormonal response and bacterial metabolites. We will also talk a little about LPS now, but bacterial metabolites can cross the intestinal barrier and interact with neuronal cells. This also seems to me a wonderful synthesis of what happens when the barrier is lost. whether due to toxins, microorganisms, gluten, drugs, or anything else you can think of. The immune system is activated first, logically, because it starts to encounter foreign elements that it must attack and block to prevent invasion. This is simply a logical response. However, the consequences of this problem include malabsorption, autoimmunity, food intolerances, disruption of the blood-brain barrier, and systemic inflammation. In other words, it's not insignificant. That's why I tell you that the significance of intestinal permeability is tremendous. When the barrier breaks, one of the first consequences we have is food intolerance reactions and autoimmunity. That is the most immediate effect. Clearly, we will have the entry of bacteria, viruses, parasites, xenobiotics, etc. So imagine it's like we were being attacked on all fronts in our castle. Remember that the immune nervous system is the most sensitive to toxins, so it is the most likely to be affected initially when there is significant poisoning. Type 3 allergy is the delayed allergy that Teresa mentioned, which is a consequence of increased intestinal permeability if it is not addressed. So when we have a person with many intolerances, what it indicates is that we need to treat the intestine. Although temporarily removing certain foods can help slow down that process, the real issue lies in the integrity of the intestinal wall. Now we are going to talk about the fact that apart from having a broken intestinal barrier, dysbiosis, and poor signaling, we have a lot of toxins that are produced in the gut microbiota when there is dysbiosis. And especially when these proteolytic bacteria are overgrown, there is a process that is increasingly being documented in the literature, which is metabolic endotoxemia. This process depends on the microbiota that carries LPS, which are lipopolysaccharides from the membranes of gram-negative bacteria. I have listed some here to remind you that these gram-negative bacteria, Klebsiella, Enterobacter, Serratia, Proteus, E. coli, and Pseudomonas, are part of the proteolytic bacteria I mentioned earlier. In other words, this microbiota, which consists of these bacteria, carries LPS, which is an endotoxin that causes a problem of systemic inflammation and subclinical intoxication. Well, without further ado, the LPS here explains how it binds to membrane receptors, but I can't elaborate on that. This is a very nice image to explain lipopolysaccharide, and the lipopolysaccharide molecule is very complex, which is why it generates reactions that are difficult to modulate. It is truly one of the complex toxins. It is a toxin from within. There is no need to be exposed to external toxins when we already have this overgrowth. We do not need to expose ourselves from the outside because we are causing an impressive intoxication from within. So, the LPS, lipopolysaccharides, imagine there is an increase of proteolytic bacteria in the intestine. The contact with them, the LPS at a local level will cause inflammation, but at a systemic level, they will lead to endotoxemia and a process of silent inflammation. This systemic process is not possible without an increase in intestinal permeability, because otherwise those LPS, lipopolysaccharides, would not spread to the rest of the organism. And this is the definition, which is a subclinical systemic intoxication of low grade caused by endotoxins from these gram-negative bacteria originating from the intestine. Well, the other thing would be, on one hand, we have two ways to continuously become intoxicated due to having a problem of intestinal dysbiosis and increased permeability. One is through LPS, lipopolysaccharides, right? And that would be metabolic endotoxemia. The other is due to the final metabolites of protein degradation. When there is an increase in proteolytics, a lot of things are produced, such as phenolic compounds, biogenic amines, uremic toxins, ammonia, and so on, a whole bunch of things. And I will only mention two, which are biogenic amines and ammonia, because I encounter them a lot, very much, within the amines. I have provided a synthesis of all of them, but nothing. Just a note on putrescine, spermidine, and spermine, which affect neuronal and glial receptors, channels, and neurotransmitters, being implicated in the development of various nervous system disorders. I simply put them there because just by searching for biogenic amines related to these three, you will find a lot of interesting data on how they affect the nervous system. And ammonia. Let's see, the ammonia we have is produced in a way that the body is accustomed to, neutralizing through two pathways. Initially, we neutralize it because ammonia is very irritating to mucous membranes. We add a proton, and while it is not non-toxic, it is eliminated through feces or the kidneys. When the pH in the intestine exceeds 6, the hepatic urea cycle is activated, although I believe the range is up to 6.4. In 6, the body jumps and activates this cycle to neutralize the excessive production of ammonia. But if this fails, which is what I always see in many neurodegenerative diseases and always in autism, ammonia accumulates to the point of causing severe damage to the nervous system. Ammonium is a highly neurotoxic compound that rapidly diffuses across the blood-brain barrier. These are 3 little examples for now. This is a very simple analysis by functional groups that provides me with wonderful information. I have provided you with a comparison. It is a person with depression that has evolved over 20 years, and this analysis on the left shows ecolibiovae, an increase in proteolytics, a decrease in bifidobacteria, bacteroides, and mucolytic bacteria, and a reduced total number of microorganisms. As I mentioned, one of the problems of dysbiosis is also the lack of sufficient microorganisms to work as a super team. Well, this analysis is only 2 months later, in which we have worked on the enteric nervous system. Before receiving this analysis, she literally told me, "It's not that I'm better, it's that I didn't remember it was like this." Imagine this. And I say this to you, this doesn't happen all the time, of course, but to help you understand that for some people it's just a matter of microbiota, 2009. At 19 years old, she went through whatever it was, and no one did anything to organize that matter, leaving her with continuous depression. You can see here that there is no longer an overgrowth of proteolytics. The protective microbiota, the muconutritive one, has improved significantly. The change is spectacular. It's not easy to achieve this in 2 months, and the total count of microorganisms is already normal. But what I was particularly interested in conveying is that between this and this, there is a depression to an absolutely normal state of mood. This is a case of a child with developmental delay, as they cannot yet be diagnosed with autism due to their age. But the overgrowth of proteolytic bacteria in these children is significant. I have an E. coli, for which there are no more arrows to include in the analysis. I have other proteolytic microorganisms through the roof. Kermansia is always low, which is fundamental. And there is an intestinal candidiasis that serves as the reservoir for any candidiasis in mucous membranes. This is somewhat to reinforce what we have discussed. This is an ALS case. It is a person who, I won't say is cured, but is absolutely stabilized. And I already have the next analysis, but I didn't have time to include it as a comparison of stool samples. But well, you see, the scenario is the same as in the previous overgrowth of E. coli, with aggressive proteolytic microorganisms, a terrible muconutritive environment, and a brutal intestinal candidiasis. This is one with the other. Well, just a small note, which is a topic I have studied the most recently, and that is that bacteria have 2 modes of living in nature. One is planktonic mode of free floating. Oh, I still have time. Or in biofilm mode, in colonies of microorganisms attached to a structure. I don't remember it well, but I believe that 90-something% of bacteria live in a sessile form, in the form of a biofilm, which means that everything we have studied since the times of Koch is in a free-floating form, and that is not the reality. Bacteria in the biofilm have a different phenotypic expression, making it difficult for what we provide in vitro to function as an antibiotic in the same way in a living organism. Why have I brought up the topic of biofilms? Because I have encountered them every time in those analyses you have seen. I also have photos, but I haven't included them because we are already extending the discussion about the tons of biofilm that these individuals may have in their intestines. These phenotypically altered bacteria are more toxic producers. They are unbeatable because they establish their stronghold there, a stronghold that attracts heavy metals. In other words, the topic of biofilms is fascinating. It's truly captivating. I delved into proteolytic bacteria and found it to be another new model for understanding the whole concept of infection, because it's a different story. And we are increasingly seeing this issue of bacterial resistance. Why? Because we have moved from acute infection to chronic infections to chronic inflammation, and what was studied in vitro does not work there. This is my opinion. On the left, you can see the difference between bacteria in planktonic mode and when they form biofilm. And here, if we do not degrade this biofilm, neither natural nor unnatural methods, nor antibiotics, nor anything else will work. They are simply protected behind a protective shield. This is the formation of a biofilm A bacterium attaches here, and when they reach a certain number, they start producing the matrix of exopolysaccharides and end up creating an incredible superstructure that has channels for water and nutrients to reach them. You can't imagine it. It's very similar to the entire structure of ants. This is what we have as a barrier to prevent bacteria from colonizing here. The mucus layer is another topic of great interest. It has two parts: the outer layer, where the bacteria live, and the inner layer, which is practically sterile. Additionally, it contains a lot of substances to protect us from invasion. That layer would protect us from the formation of biofilms that come into contact with the epithelium. Well, I found several studies on this, as this is a state of homeostasis in acute infection in IBD. They are forming colonies, meaning they are creating bacterial biofilms, often with these proteolytic bacteria. This is already in the context of cancer, when there is total invasion, and those trenches are becoming larger and larger. Well, without further ado, let's return to those troublesome bacteria in the descending colon, which are also the ones that concern me in neurodegenerative disorders as biofilm formers, because that's just what we needed. You've already seen their wickedness. Just being in overgrowth is bad enough, but when they form these biofilms, it's brutal. And because I am interested in a note, an increase in proteolytic means an increase in proteases and destruction of the mucus layer, which exposes us to the possibility of breaching that barrier and colonizing anything, even what I believe is extra-intestinally. I found two details interesting: how bacteria in biofilm mode produce proteins that adopt an amyloid conformation, which I will leave as a topic for further investigation, because it is responsible for diseases such as Alzheimer's. And on the other hand, I saw that in Boston, they were studying how this amyloid protein could have a function within the immune system that should never be the target of the therapeutic approach against Alzheimer's. There lies the question, simply put: when bacteria form biofilm, they produce beta-amyloid protein. What is the relationship between protein formation and the growth of pathogens? Surely it is primarily a defense response if it is a consequence, but certainly what needs to be targeted is not the beta-amyloid protein. And we should always look at this, and I also have quite a few cases in this field of cognitive problems, of different types of dementias, in which the intestinal microbiota is absolutely important, and that's it. I've just run out of time.